The storm clouds gathering over Europe in 1588 were not merely meteorological. They were political, religious, and existential. For decades, the continent had been torn apart by the Reformation, Catholic versus Protestant, kingdom versus kingdom, brother against brother. And at the center of this maelstrom stood two figures whose enmity would define an era: Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth I of England. Philip was the most powerful monarch in Christendom. His empire stretched across continents, from the silver mines of Peru to the spice islands of the Philippines. The Spanish treasury overflowed with New World gold, funding armies that had crushed revolts and defended the Catholic faith across Europe. Philip saw himself as God's instrument on earth, the defender of the true church against the Protestant heresy spreading like plague through northern Europe. Elizabeth, by contrast, ruled a small island nation perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy. England was a Protestant realm, having broken with Rome under her father, Henry VIII. To Catholic Europe, Elizabeth was illegitimate, a heretic, a woman who had no right to wear a crown. Pope Sixtus V had excommunicated her, effectively declaring open season on her life and throne. Assassination plots were constant. Spanish gold funded conspiracies in Ireland and Scotland. The noose was tightening. But Elizabeth was no helpless victim. She was cunning, patient, and ruthless when necessary. For years, she had played a dangerous game, supporting Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, authorizing privateers like Francis Drake to plunder Spanish treasure fleets, all while maintaining the thinnest veneer of plausible deniability. She knew she was poking a bear, but she also knew that bear's attention was divided across a global empire. Philip had tolerated these provocations for years, constrained by wars on multiple fronts and the logistical nightmare of projecting power across oceans. But by 1587, his patience had finally shattered. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic claimant to the English throne, was the final straw. Mary's death removed any moral ambiguity. Now, Philip could present his invasion not as naked aggression but as a holy crusade to restore the true faith to England and place a Catholic monarch on the throne. The plan was audacious in its scale. The Spanish Armada would sail from Lisbon up the English Channel to link with the Duke of Parma's veteran army in the Netherlands, the finest fighting force in Europe, 30,000 strong. These soldiers, who had terrorized Protestant rebels for decades, would be ferried across the narrow sea to England's shores. Once landed, they would march on London. Elizabeth would be deposed, executed, or forced to flee. England would be Catholic again, and Philip's dominance would be complete. Preparations began in earnest throughout 1587. Shipyards across Spain and Portugal worked day and night. The Armada would consist of 130 ships, including massive galleons bristling with cannons, swift pinnaces for scouting, and hulking transport vessels packed with soldiers, horses, and siege equipment. 24,000 sailors and soldiers would crew these vessels. 8,000 more waited with Parma in Flanders. Priests blessed the fleet. Nobles competed for commands. This was more than a military expedition, it was a crusade, sanctioned by the Pope himself. But assembling such a force was a Herculean task fraught with delays. Drake's daring raid on Cadiz in April 1587, the singeing of the King of Spain's beard, had destroyed supplies and delayed the departure by a year. The appointed commander, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, died before the fleet could sail, forcing Philip to appoint the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a competent administrator but no naval commander. Medina Sidonia himself begged to be excused, citing his inexperience and susceptibility to seasickness. Philip insisted. The die was cast. In May 1588, the Armada finally departed Lisbon. The largest invasion fleet ever assembled pointed its prows toward England. On paper, it was invincible. In reality, it was about to face an enemy that would exploit every weakness, and a weapon that would turn the Channel waters into a nightmare of flame and terror. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. England was not ready. That was the terrifying truth that kept Elizabeth's advisers awake at night as reports of the Armada's approach filtered in through spy networks and merchant vessels. The Royal Navy, such as it was, numbered only 34 ships of fighting quality. Against Spain's 130, the mathematics were brutal. But numbers told only part of the story. The English ships were different, leaner, faster, built for a new kind of warfare. Where Spanish galleons were essentially floating fortresses designed to close with enemy ships and unleash soldiers for boarding actions, English vessels were gun platforms. They sat lower in the water, could sail closer to the wind, and carried longer-range cannons designed to pound enemies from a distance. The tactical doctrine was revolutionary. Stay at range, use superior maneuverability to avoid being grappled, and let artillery do the killing. This approach had been developed over years of experience fighting in the treacherous waters around the British Isles and through countless engagements with pirates, privateers, and Spanish colonial forces. Men like John Hawkins, the treasurer of the Navy, had redesigned English warships to be sleeker and deadlier. Francis Drake, the most famous sea dog of them all, had perfected the art of hit-and-run warfare against Spanish treasure fleets. These were not gentlemen playing at war. They were professionals who had made fortunes and reputations by outthinking and outfighting opponents. But could innovation and skill overcome such overwhelming numerical superiority? Elizabeth's War Council was divided. Some advocated meeting the Armada at sea with everything England could muster. Others wanted to hold the fleet in reserve and focus on coastal defenses, building fortifications and raising militia. The compromise was typically Elizabethan: do everything at once and hope something worked. Lord Howard of Effingham, a nobleman with more political acumen than naval experience, was given overall command of the English fleet. It was a careful choice. Howard had the social standing to command respect from the aristocratic captains, but he was wise enough to defer to the expertise of his vice-admiral, Francis Drake. This partnership would prove crucial. Howard provided legitimacy and coordination. Drake provided tactical genius and aggressive instinct. Throughout the early summer of 1588, England mobilized. Militia musters were called across the counties. Beacon chains were established along the coasts, great bonfires that could relay news of the Armada's approach from hilltop to hilltop, spreading the alarm across hundreds of miles in mere hours. Weapons were distributed, though there were never enough. Pikemen drilled in village squares. Archers, still considered useful despite the rise of gunpowder, practiced on butts. It was organized chaos, a nation girding for existential struggle. Elizabeth herself rose to the moment. She refused to flee London or hide in a secure castle. Instead, she prepared to visit her troops at Tilbury, where an army was assembling to repel Parma's veterans if they managed to cross the Channel. Her advisers were horrified. The danger was too great, the precedent too radical. But Elizabeth understood theater and symbolism. Her presence would be worth 1,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, intelligence flowed into London. Spanish sympathizers were arrested. Codes were broken. The English knew the Armada's objective: sail up the Channel, link with Parma, ferry his army across. Stop that linkage, and the invasion would fail. But how? The Spanish fleet was too powerful to simply destroy in open battle. England's smaller force would be overwhelmed in a traditional fleet engagement. This was when the idea began to take shape, an idea born from desperation, historical precedent, and tactical imagination. It was a weapon that required no exotic materials, no advanced engineering. It had been used before in naval warfare, but never on such a scale, never with such perfect timing and psychological impact. The weapon was fire itself. Not artillery fire or Greek fire or any sophisticated incendiary device. Simply fire, ancient, primal, unstoppable. But to understand how this weapon would be deployed, and why it would prove so devastatingly effective, one must first understand the nature of wooden sailing ships, the psychology of sailors, and the particular vulnerabilities of the Spanish tactical formation. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic reversals. On July 19, 1588, the Armada was sighted off the Lizard, the southernmost point of Cornwall. The beacons flared to life. Within hours, all England knew they had come. The Spanish fleet advanced up the channel in a crescent formation, a vast arc of warships stretching 7 miles from wing to wing. It was a sight never before witnessed in those waters, a floating city of wood and canvas, banners streaming, the largest concentration of naval power ever assembled. The formation itself was a masterpiece of defensive design. The strongest galleons held the tips of the crescent and the center, protecting the vulnerable transport ships carrying supplies and soldiers. Any attacker would have to penetrate this wall of guns and soldiers to reach the softer targets within. It was a formation designed to intimidate, to absorb attacks, and to grind forward with inexorable momentum. The English fleet, assembled at Plymouth under Drake's watchful eye, scrambled to respond. Getting ships out of harbor against the prevailing winds was a nightmare of seamanship, but by the evening of July 19th, Howard had managed to get the bulk of his fleet to sea. The chase was on. What followed over the next week was a running battle unlike anything naval warfare had seen before. The English shadowed the Armada up the channel, darting in to attack the flanks and rear, then dancing away before the Spanish could close for boarding. Drake's flagship, the Revenge, led attack after attack. The English tactics were maddening to the Spanish. The heretics refused to fight honorably, refused to close and settle things like men. Instead, they circled at distance, their longer-range culverins pounding away at Spanish hulls. The engagements off Portland Bill and the Isle of Wight demonstrated the fundamental tactical mismatch. Spanish gunnery was designed for close-range work, heavy cannons that would shatter enemy ships just before boarding. But the range was too short. The English stayed beyond effective Spanish range and used their superior sailing qualities to maintain that distance. It was frustrating, exhausting work for both sides. The English expended enormous quantities of powder and shot, but failed to sink any major Spanish vessels. The Spanish maintained formation and continued their advance, but couldn't bring the enemy to decisive battle. Yet the Armada was suffering. Ships were damaged by English gunnery, not sunk, but holed, their rigging cut, their crews bloodied. Worse, critical supplies were running low. The Spanish had expected quick resupply from Parma's forces once they reached the Netherlands coast. That rendezvous was now everything. By July 27th, the Armada reached Calais and dropped anchor. They had made it. Battered but intact, the fleet now waited for word from Parma. Couriers raced back and forth. The plan was to coordinate exactly. Parma would load his army onto barges, the Armada would provide escort, and together they would cross to England. But there was a problem, a potentially fatal flaw that was about to reveal itself. Parma's barges were trapped in the shallow ports and canals of Flanders, blockaded by Dutch rebel ships, shallow draft vessels that could operate in waters too shoal for Spanish galleons. The deep-drafted warships of the Armada couldn't get close enough to protect the barges during their vulnerable crossing. The logistics that had seemed so elegant on paper in Madrid were collapsing in the messy reality of tide, wind, and enemy action. Medina Sidonia grew anxious. His fleet sat at anchor in an exposed roadstead with enemy vessels prowling nearby. Every hour at anchor was an hour of danger. Anchored ships were vulnerable. Crews were tired. Supplies were dwindling. The longer they waited, the more the English would prepare something nasty. And in the English War Council aboard Howard's flagship, that something was being planned. Fireships. The word was spoken first tentatively, then with growing conviction. It was a desperate tactic, expensive and not guaranteed to work. But the strategic situation demanded action. The Armada could not be allowed to link with Parma. If that happened, England would face invasion by the most formidable army in Europe. The decision was made. 8 ships would be sacrificed, and the night of July 28th would become a night of terror. Fire at sea was the nightmare that haunted every sailor's dreams. Wooden ships soaked in tar and pitch, their holds packed with gunpowder and their decks cluttered with tarred rope and canvas sails, they were floating pyres waiting for a spark. Once fire took hold, there was often no stopping it. The crew faced a horrible choice: burn or drown. This primal fear was hardwired into every man who went to sea. Fireships exploited that fear. The concept was ancient: load a vessel with combustibles, set it ablaze, and send it drifting or sailing into enemy ships at anchor. If successful, the fireship would lodge against an enemy vessel, the flames would spread, and panic would ensue. Even if the fireship didn't physically contact its target, the psychological effect was devastating. Anchored fleets would cut their cables and scatter rather than risk being burned alive. The English had used fireships before in smaller engagements. But what they planned for the night of July 28, 1588, was on an unprecedented scale. 8 ships would be converted into floating infernos. Not small boats or obsolete hulks, but substantial vessels, some over 200 tons. This was an enormous sacrifice in financial terms, but the stakes justified it. The ships were prepared throughout the day. Their holds were packed with pitch, tar, brimstone, and anything else that would burn hot and fast. Gunpowder was deliberately placed throughout the vessels, not enough for a single catastrophic explosion, but enough to create terrifying secondary blasts as the fires reached different powder kegs. The rigging was treated with additional tar. The guns were loaded and left to cook off randomly as the flames heated them, creating an unpredictable barrage that would add to the chaos. Crucially, the ships were prepared to sail themselves. Skeleton crews would guide them toward the Spanish fleet, set the fires, and then escape in boats towed behind. The timing had to be perfect. The tide, the wind, the darkness, all had to align. And they did. The night of July 28th was dark, the moon obscured by clouds. The tide was favorable, running toward the Spanish fleet. A following wind pushed from the west. At midnight, the operation began. The 8 fireships hoisted sail and slipped their moorings. Their skeleton crews steered them toward the massed shapes of the Armada, barely visible in the darkness. Then, at the last possible moment, the fires were lit. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Flames roared up the masts and along the decks. The ships, driven by wind and tide, bore down on the anchored Spanish fleet like burning demons. The guns, heating in the flames, began to discharge randomly, thunderous booms that shattered the night and added to the terror. To the Spanish lookouts, it must have seemed like the apocalypse. Not one fireship, but 8. Not small boats, but substantial vessels, fully ablaze and sailing directly at them with malevolent purpose. Panic swept through the Armada. Medina Sidonia's orders were clear and sensible. Designated pinnaces should tow the fireships away from the fleet. Several tried, but the psychological pressure was too great. Captains, seeing the wall of flame bearing down on them, made individual decisions. They cut their anchor cables rather than take time to haul them up. One by one, then in a rush, Spanish ships scattered into the darkness. The discipline that had held the Armada together through a week of running battles evaporated in minutes. The crescent formation, that masterpiece of defensive design, dissolved. Ships collided in the darkness. Some drifted onto the shoals. Others sailed away from the danger, away from each other, away from mutual support. By dawn, the Armada was scattered along miles of coastline, no longer a unified fighting force but a collection of isolated vessels. Not a single English fireship actually contacted a Spanish vessel. Not one Spanish ship was burned. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. The weapon had worked not through physical destruction but through terror. And now, as dawn broke on July 29th, the English fleet descended on the scattered Armada like wolves on a broken flock. The Battle of Gravelines was about to begin. Dawn on July 29, 1588, revealed the full extent of the Spanish disaster. The proud crescent formation that had sailed up the Channel with such confidence was gone. Ships were scattered across miles of sea, isolated and vulnerable. Some were dangerously close to the Flemish shoals. Others had collided during the night, sustaining damage to hulls and rigging. Communication between vessels was chaotic. The command structure, dependent on visual signals between closely grouped ships, had broken down. The English saw their opportunity and seized it with predatory efficiency. This was the moment Drake had been waiting for, the enemy divided, disoriented, unable to coordinate. Howard gave the signal and the English fleet attacked with everything they had. The Battle of Gravelines was unlike the earlier skirmishes. This time, the English closed to much shorter range, unleashing broadsides that smashed into Spanish hulls with devastating effect. Without the protective formation, Spanish ships had to fight as individuals, and individually they were vulnerable to the faster, more maneuverable English vessels. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, became the focus of repeated attacks. Drake's Revenge led assault after assault, supported by a dozen other English warships. The Spanish flagship fought with desperate courage, her guns blazing, her soldiers firing muskets from the rails. But she was gradually being pounded to pieces. Her hull was holed in multiple places. Her rigging was cut to ribbons. Casualties mounted horrifically. Other Spanish ships fared no better. The San Felipe and the San Mateo, both powerful galleons, were battered into near wrecks. The Maria Juan, overwhelmed by English gunnery, began to sink, her pumps unable to cope with the water pouring through shot holes. She went down in shallow water with heavy loss of life, the first Spanish warship to be sunk in the entire campaign. The fighting was brutal and sustained, lasting the better part of 8 hours. English ships worked in packs, focusing fire on individual Spanish vessels, then moving to the next target once the first was sufficiently damaged. The Spanish fought back with immense courage, but they were fighting the wrong kind of battle. Their tactics, designed around boarding and close combat, were useless against an enemy that refused to be boarded. By early afternoon, the English faced a new problem: ammunition. They had expended virtually their entire stock of powder and shot. Guns fell silent not from lack of will but from empty magazines. It was a frustrating moment. The Spanish were beaten, scattered, many ships severely damaged. But without ammunition, the English couldn't deliver the finishing blow. Medina Sidonia, surveying the catastrophe from his battered flagship, faced the brutal truth: the enterprise had failed. His fleet was too damaged to face another such engagement. Linking with Parma was impossible. The Dutch blockade remained unbroken, and even if Parma could get his barges out, the Armada was in no condition to protect them. The only option was retreat. But retreat where? Sailing back down the Channel meant fighting past the English fleet again, this time into the prevailing westerly winds. The ships were too damaged, the crews too exhausted. The only viable escape route was north, around Scotland and Ireland, then south to Spain. It was a tremendous detour, thousands of miles through dangerous waters with inadequate supplies and damaged ships. But it was the only option. On July 30th, the Armada began its retreat northward, pursued by the English for 2 more days until Howard broke off the chase, satisfied that the invasion threat was over. Elizabeth's realm was saved. But the Armada's ordeal was far from finished. As the Spanish fleet limped north into the cold waters beyond Scotland, they sailed toward a different kind of destruction. No enemy cannons would greet them, but something far more implacable, the North Atlantic in storm season, with all its fury and indifference. The journey home would claim more ships and lives than all the English attacks combined. But in the moment, as Howard's fleet turned back toward England and the Spanish sailed into the northern mists, one thing was clear: the fireships at Calais had been the turning point. That single night of terror had shattered Spanish cohesion and created the conditions for Gravelines. The secret weapon had worked. Why were the fireships so effective? The answer lies not in their physical destructiveness. They destroyed nothing directly, but in their psychological impact and the specific vulnerabilities of the Spanish situation. Understanding this requires examining the nature of early modern naval warfare and the peculiar circumstances of the Armada's position at Calais. First, the location was critical. The Armada was anchored in the Calais roadstead, an exposed anchorage with treacherous currents and sandbanks. The ships were packed together for mutual protection, but this density created its own danger. If panic struck and ships began cutting cables, collisions were inevitable. There was no safe harbor to retreat into, no protective bay where the fleet could regroup under shore batteries. Second, the Spanish had good reason to fear fireships more than most. 3 years earlier, in 1585, during the siege of Antwerp, Spanish forces had witnessed the most terrifying fireship attack in history. The Dutch defender, an Italian engineer named Federigo Giambelli, had created hellburners, ships packed with tons of gunpowder designed to explode with devastating force. When these drifted into the Spanish pontoon bridge across the Scheldt River, the explosion killed 800 men instantly and broke the siege. Giambelli was now in England, working for Elizabeth. Spanish intelligence knew this. When the fireships appeared at Calais, many Spanish captains assumed they were Giambelli's hellburners, floating bombs that could annihilate entire sections of the fleet if they made contact. This wasn't irrational paranoia. It was learned caution based on recent, traumatic experience. The decision to cut cables and scatter made perfect sense if you believed the incoming vessels were packed with tons of gunpowder. Third, the timing was perfect. The Armada had been at sea for weeks, constantly harassed by English attacks. Crews were exhausted. Supplies were running low. Morale was fragile. The frustration of waiting at Calais for Parma, not knowing when or if the rendezvous would happen, created additional stress. In such a state, discipline can fracture quickly when faced with existential threat. Fourth, the nature of command in the Spanish fleet exacerbated the crisis. While Medina Sidonia was overall commander, individual captains had significant autonomy, particularly the noblemen who commanded their own vessels. When threat appeared, each captain made his own assessment and decision. There was no time for careful coordination, no opportunity to verify whether the fireships were actually hellburners. Individual ships cutting cables created pressure on neighboring vessels to do the same. Panic became contagious. The English, whether through brilliant planning or good fortune, had struck at precisely the right moment with exactly the right weapon. If they had attacked with fireships earlier, when the Armada was underway and in formation, the Spanish could have maneuvered to avoid them while maintaining formation. If they had attacked later, after the link-up with Parma, had it happened, the Spanish might have been in a more secure anchorage or already committed to the crossing. But at Calais, at that specific moment, the Armada was at its most vulnerable. The fireships also represented a kind of asymmetric warfare that played to English strengths. England couldn't match Spain's resources in conventional terms, the tonnage, the soldiers, the sheer weight of metal. But creativity, tactical innovation, and understanding of the operational environment were different matters. The English commanders, Drake especially, understood their enemy's psychology and exploited it ruthlessly. There's a broader lesson here about military innovation. The most effective weapons are often not the most sophisticated or expensive, but those that exploit specific enemy vulnerabilities at critical moments. The fireships were low-tech, crude even. But they worked because they targeted a specific fear, in a specific situation, at a specific time. The conditions for their effectiveness were narrow, but within those conditions, they were devastating. This is why the fireships deserve recognition as the secret weapon that destroyed the Armada. Not because they sank ships, they didn't. Not because they killed men, they didn't. But because they broke the Spanish formation and fighting spirit at the crucial moment, creating the conditions for Gravelines and ultimately for the Armada's catastrophic retreat. Sometimes in war, psychology is more powerful than artillery. As the Armada sailed north into the grey waters beyond Scotland, the full magnitude of the disaster began to unfold. The fleet was in desperate condition. Ships were battle-damaged, their hulls patched with whatever materials could be found, their rigging jury-rigged with scraps of rope and canvas. Water supplies were dangerously low, rationed to pints per day. Food was running out. Disease was spreading in the crowded, unsanitary conditions below decks. And ahead lay some of the most dangerous waters in Europe. The route home would take the Spanish around the north of Scotland, then down the western coast of Ireland before finally turning east toward Spain. It was a journey of over 2,000 miles through notoriously treacherous waters. The North Atlantic in late summer and early autumn is unpredictable. Sudden squalls, heavy seas, thick fog. 4 damaged ships with exhausted crews. These conditions would prove more deadly than any English cannons. Medina Sidonia issued strict orders. Stay together, maintain course, do not attempt to land in Ireland or Scotland. The English had agents everywhere, and Protestant Scots or hostile Irish would show no mercy. The only safety lay in reaching Spain. But staying together proved impossible. The damaged ships couldn't keep pace. Some, taking on water faster than their pumps could clear it, fell behind. Others, desperate for fresh water and food, broke from the fleet and made for shore despite orders. The storms began in mid-August. Great Atlantic gales swept across the fleet, driving ships before them, scattering vessels that had managed to stay together after Gravelines. Ships that might have survived the battering in good condition foundered with their damaged hulls and rigging. One by one, they went down, sometimes with all hands, sometimes with survivors clinging to wreckage, praying for rescue that rarely came. The western coast of Ireland became a graveyard. At least 24 Spanish ships were wrecked along that rocky coastline, dashed to pieces on cliffs and reefs in the driving rain and massive surf. Survivors who made it ashore faced a grim fate. Ireland was partially under English control, and English officials offered bounties for Spanish heads. Even in areas controlled by Irish clans, survival was uncertain. Some clans offered protection, moved by pity or hope of ransom. Others slaughtered the castaways or handed them over to English authorities for execution. The scenes of destruction were apocalyptic. At Streedac Strand in County Sligo, 3 Spanish ships, La Levia, La Juliana, and the Santa Maria de Vicen, wrecked simultaneously. Over 1,000 men struggled through the surf. Most drowned. The survivors, staggering onto the beach, were systematically hunted down. Only a handful escaped. Similar tragedies played out at dozens of locations from Donegal to Kerry. Not all the losses were from storms. Some ships, their hulls compromised by battle damage and weeks at sea, simply came apart. Seams opened up. Planking gave way. The ocean rushed in. Crews had minutes to abandon ship if they were lucky. The San Juan de Sicilia, a massive 850-ton galleon, sank off the Blasket Islands with the loss of all hands. The Grand Griffin, flagship of the supply squadron, wrecked in the Shetlands. Her survivors eventually made it back to Spain, but it took months. Throughout September and October, battered Spanish ships continued to limp into northern Spanish ports. Each arrival brought news of other vessels lost, other ships that had been seen weeks earlier but never arrived. The tallies grew grimmer with each report. The human cost was staggering, perhaps 15,000 men lost, two-thirds of the expedition's strength. Over 60 ships had been destroyed, though the exact number would never be known with certainty. In Madrid, Philip II received the reports with grim stoicism. He had invested an enormous fortune in the enterprise of England, more than 10 million ducats. The flower of Spanish nobility had perished. The aura of Spanish invincibility had been shattered. Yet Philip's response was characteristic. He withdrew to pray, accepting God's judgment, already planning how the loss could be managed politically. But in England, as autumn gave way to winter, the mood was jubilant. Against all odds, the realm had survived. The immediate aftermath in England was relief mixed with celebration and, crucially, myth-making. The defeat of the Armada was instantly recognized as a pivotal moment, and the interpretation of how it happened began immediately. Elizabeth and her propagandists understood the importance of controlling the narrative. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a divine judgment, proof that God favored Protestant England over Catholic Spain. The most famous artifact of this propaganda effort was a medal struck to commemorate the victory, bearing the Latin inscription, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt, Jehovah blew and they were scattered. The message was clear. The storms that destroyed so much of the Armada on its retreat were divine intervention. England's survival was God's will. This narrative served multiple purposes. It united the nation in religious terms, legitimized Elizabeth's rule, and positioned England as a Protestant champion. But the reality was more complex than the propaganda suggested. The storms did indeed destroy many Spanish ships during the retreat, but that retreat only happened because the Armada had already been defeated tactically. The fireships at Calais and the Battle of Gravelines had broken Spanish cohesion and forced Medina Sidonia to choose retreat over continued operations. The storms were the coup de grace, not the decisive factor. Yet the Protestant wind became the dominant explanation in popular memory. The fireships themselves received relatively little attention in contemporary accounts. They hadn't sunk any ships. They hadn't killed any men. Compared to the dramatic battle scenes at Gravelines or the spectacular wrecks on Irish coasts, they seemed almost anticlimactic. Yet experienced naval officers understood their importance. Howard wrote in his dispatches that the fireships had put such terror into the Spanish that they lost their formation. Drake, in his typically understated way, noted that the Spanish had broken their array. The strategic consequences of the Armada's defeat were profound and long-lasting. Spain's aura of invincibility was shattered. Philip II would launch 2 more armadas against England in the 1590s, but neither achieved even the limited success of the 1588 expedition. The balance of naval power began shifting toward England, a process that would continue over the following centuries. English confidence soared. The privateering war against Spanish shipping intensified. Drake and others launched raids on Spanish ports and colonies with renewed aggression. The Dutch rebels in the Netherlands, seeing that Spain could be beaten, fought with renewed determination. The Armada's defeat didn't end the Anglo-Spanish War. That would drag on for another 16 years, but it ensured that Spain would never successfully invade England. For Philip II, the defeat was a personal and political catastrophe. The enterprise of England had been his great project, years in the planning, blessed by the Pope, supported with Spain's vast resources. Its failure called into question his judgment and, more dangerously, suggested that God might not favor Spain's cause after all. Philip responded by doubling down, building more ships, planning new expeditions, refusing to accept that the age of Spanish dominance might be ending. Elizabeth, meanwhile, used the victory to solidify her position. She had already been a skilled political operator, but now she was the queen who had saved England from the greatest invasion threat in living memory. Her visit to Tilbury, where she had addressed the troops with words that became legendary, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," was timed for maximum impact. The speech, delivered after the Armada was already retreating but before news reached London, became a cornerstone of Elizabethan propaganda. The veterans of the campaign, Drake, Howard, Hawkins, and dozens of other captains, were celebrated as heroes. They received honors, titles, and in some cases monetary rewards, though Elizabeth was notoriously tight-fisted even in victory. These men became the nucleus of a professional naval officer class that would serve England for decades. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. England, a relatively small nation on the periphery of Europe, had defeated the greatest empire in the world. The confidence this generated would fuel English expansion, commercial, colonial, and naval, for generations. The seeds of the British Empire, though no one could have recognized it at the time, were planted in the summer of 1588. To fully understand the significance of the fireships, we must examine the broader evolution of naval warfare in the Age of Sail. The late 16th century was a period of rapid technological and tactical innovation at sea, and the Armada campaign represented a clash between old and new approaches to naval combat. The Spanish approach to naval warfare was fundamentally medieval. Their galleons were designed to carry large numbers of soldiers. Naval battles were essentially land battles fought on water. Ships would close, grapple together, and soldiers would board the enemy vessel. Victory went to whoever had more men and better close-quarters fighters. Cannons were secondary weapons, used primarily in the moments before boarding to soften up the enemy crew. This approach had worked spectacularly well for Spain in the Mediterranean, particularly at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Christian coalition led by Spanish forces had destroyed the Ottoman Turkish fleet. Lepanto was fought using galleys, oar-powered warships packed with soldiers, and the tactics were essentially unchanged from ancient times. Spain's military culture was shaped by such victories, by centuries of success using these methods. The English approach was radically different. England couldn't afford to match Spain in soldiers or ships, so English commanders had developed tactics that played to different strengths. English ships were gun platforms designed to fight at range. The idea was to use superior sailing qualities to maintain distance, then pound the enemy with artillery until they surrendered or sank. Boarding was avoided if possible. It was too risky, too costly in casualties. This tactical revolution had profound implications. It meant that seamanship became as important as fighting ability. A captain who could handle his ship in all conditions, who could position his vessel to deliver broadsides while avoiding enemy fire, was more valuable than the bravest soldier. It also meant that gunnery became a specialized skill. English gun crews trained constantly, developing techniques to load and fire faster, to adjust aim for rolling seas, to target specific parts of enemy ships. The fireships fit perfectly into this tactical philosophy. They were a weapon that exploited enemy weakness from distance, that required no close combat, that used psychology and fear as much as physical force. They were asymmetric, creative, and perfectly adapted to English strengths and Spanish vulnerabilities. But the fireships also represented something deeper, a willingness to think unconventionally, to discard traditional notions of honor in combat in favor of effectiveness. There was nothing glorious about fireships. They were sneaky, terrifying, and deeply dishonorable by traditional standards of war. Spanish nobles later complained bitterly about this cowardly tactic. But the English commanders didn't care about Spanish notions of honor. They cared about winning. This clash of military cultures, traditional versus innovative, honor-bound versus pragmatic, would replay itself many times over the following centuries. Generally, the pragmatists won. The nations that adapted fastest to new technologies and tactics tended to dominate. Spain, locked into traditional approaches by pride and precedent, would gradually decline as a military power. England, more flexible and willing to innovate, would rise. The Armada campaign also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and preparation. English commanders knew the Spanish feared fireships because of the Antwerp incident. They knew the vulnerabilities of the Spanish formation. They knew the tides and winds at Calais. This wasn't luck, it was the result of careful planning, good intelligence networks, and commanders who studied their enemy's psychology as carefully as their tactics. In modern military terms, the fireships were a force multiplier, a relatively cheap weapon that created effects far beyond its direct impact. 8 sacrificed ships, costing perhaps a few £1,000s total, created conditions that led to the defeat of an expedition that had cost millions. The return on investment was extraordinary. This lesson, that creativity and psychology can be as important as raw power, remains relevant. Throughout military history, we see examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones through innovation and understanding of enemy vulnerabilities. The fireships at Calais stand as an early, clear example of this principle in action. The human stories behind the statistics deserve attention. The Armada campaign involved over 60,000 men on both sides: sailors, soldiers, officers, and support personnel. Each had his own experience of these events, his own moment of terror or triumph or simple survival. For the Spanish soldiers packed below decks in the transport ships, the experience was nightmarish from start to finish. Many had never been to sea before. They suffered terribly from seasickness, from the confined conditions, from the bad food and worse water. When the fireships appeared at Calais, most of these soldiers were trapped below with no understanding of what was happening, hearing only the screams, the thunder of cannon fire, feeling the ship lurch as cables were cut. Some drowned trapped in the holds when their ships sank during the retreat. Others died of disease or starvation on the long journey home. The Spanish sailors had their own ordeal. These were professional seamen, many from Portugal or the Mediterranean coast, impressed into service for the great enterprise. They knew their craft, but many were sailing in northern waters for the first time, dealing with Atlantic storms and English channel tides that were far more treacherous than Mediterranean conditions. The exhaustion of constant watches, the terror of battle, and then the nightmare of the retreat broke many of them. The fireships specifically became a recognized weapon in the naval arsenal. They appeared in numerous later conflicts, during the English Civil War, in various Dutch wars, and in countless smaller engagements. But they were never again quite as decisive as they had been at Calais. Commanders learned to prepare for them, to have boats ready to tow them away, to maintain better discipline when they appeared. The element of surprise and terror that had made them so effective in 1588 diminished with familiarity. The cultural impact in England was perhaps most profound. The Armada became a foundational myth of English identity, the moment when plucky England, outgunned and outmanned, defeated a tyrannical superpower through courage, innovation, and divine favor. This narrative, however simplified, shaped English self-perception for centuries. It became a template that was applied to later conflicts: Napoleon's planned invasion, the Battle of Britain in 1940. Each time, the memory of 1588 was invoked. England had stood alone before and prevailed. It could do so again. Historians debate endlessly about the what-ifs of the Armada campaign. What if the weather had been better? What if Parma had been able to get his army to the rendezvous point? What if the fireships had been countered successfully? These questions are ultimately unanswerable, but they highlight how contingent the outcome was. Small differences, wind direction, tide timing, individual captains' decisions in the heat of the moment, could have changed everything. What's undeniable is that the fireships created the condition for English victory. Without them, the Armada would have maintained its formation at Calais, possibly achieved linkage with Parma, and attempted the invasion. Whether that invasion would have succeeded is unknowable. England's land defenses were substantial, and amphibious operations are notoriously difficult. But the attempt would have been made, and English history would have followed a very different path. Instead, 8 blazing ships on a dark August night broke the Spanish formation, created the conditions for Gravelines, and sent the Armada on its disastrous retreat. The secret weapon, simple, terrifying, perfectly timed, had achieved what conventional force could not. Sometimes, history pivots on such moments of desperate creativity. As we look back across more than 4 centuries, what lessons does the Armada campaign offer? What does this story of fire, fear, and the defeat of an empire teach us about warfare, strategy, and the nature of historical change? First, there's the lesson about the limits of power. Spain in 1588 was the dominant global superpower, wealthy beyond measure, controlling territories on every continent, fielding the best army in Europe. Yet all that power couldn't guarantee victory against a smaller, poorer, but more innovative opponent fighting on home ground with desperation and creativity. Power alone is never enough. It must be properly applied, at the right time and place, against an enemy's actual vulnerabilities rather than against imagined ones. Second, there's the importance of adaptation and innovation. The English didn't try to beat Spain at Spain's own game. They couldn't match Spanish resources or manpower, so they changed the game entirely. They developed new ship designs, new tactics, new approaches to naval warfare. The fireships were part of this pattern, an unconventional weapon that exploited specific enemy weaknesses at a critical moment. Military history repeatedly confirms this lesson. Those who adapt fastest usually win. Third, there's the reality that warfare is psychological as much as physical. The fireships didn't destroy Spanish ships, but they destroyed Spanish cohesion and morale. They exploited fear, rational fear based on the memory of the Antwerp hellburners, to create effects far beyond their physical capabilities. Understanding enemy psychology, knowing what they fear and why, can be as valuable as understanding their order of battle. Fourth, there's the role of logistics and planning. Spain's strategic concept was flawed from the start. The plan required perfect coordination between a sailing fleet and an army separated by hundreds of miles, depending on wind and tide that couldn't be controlled. The English, fighting closer to home with interior lines of communication, had tremendous advantages in logistics and coordination. Even if everything else had gone right for Spain, these fundamental logistical challenges would have remained. Fifth, there's the question of leadership and decision-making under pressure. Medina Sidonia, whatever his limitations as a naval commander, faced impossible challenges. He had been given an inadequate fleet, an unrealistic mission, and insufficient supplies. Yet he held the Armada together through a week of running battles and made the correct, though agonizing, decision to retreat rather than persist in a failed operation. Sometimes, knowing when to quit is the most important decision a commander can make. For the English commanders, the lesson is different. Drake, Howard, and their colleagues demonstrated creativity, aggressiveness, and willingness to take risks. The decision to use fireships was expensive and not guaranteed to work. If it had failed, they would have faced criticism for wasting valuable ships. But they understood the strategic situation and recognized that bold action was necessary. Their willingness to take that risk paid off spectacularly. Finally, there's the reminder that history is contingent. The Armada's defeat wasn't inevitable. Different weather, different decisions by individual captains, different timing, any of these could have changed the outcome. The fireships worked because of specific circumstances that might not have existed a day earlier or later. History is full of such moments where small causes create enormous effects, where individual decisions and random factors combine to shape the destinies of nations. The story of the Spanish Armada and the fireships that helped defeat it remains relevant because it's fundamentally a human story. It's about fear and courage, about innovation and tradition, about the desperate gambles that sometimes pay off and sometimes don't. It reminds us that even the most powerful forces can be vulnerable, that creativity can overcome raw power, and that history pivots on moments of individual decision and action. On a dark night in August 1588, 8 burning ships sailed into history. They carried no troops, fired no effective shots, and sank no enemy vessels. Yet they changed the world. They showed that the secret weapon is sometimes not secret at all, just a simple idea, perfectly timed, exploiting an enemy's deepest fears. The Spanish Armada came to conquer England. Instead, it found fire in the night and terror in its own heart. And in that moment of panic and scattered flames, the course of empire turned. Sometimes, that's all it takes. The lesson echoes across the centuries. In the right circumstances, 8 burning ships can be more powerful than 130 warships of war.